Bill Russell, book writer and lyricist for Sideshow, which you will be exploring in a show at Birdland. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
How has your relationship to Sideshow evolved since you first started working on it to where we are today? And how will that influence how you present your memories and recollections from this whole process of your career?
Well, it's been a long process of evolution, we'll say that. The idea was first pitched to me in 1985, and we sat on it for 7 years before we actually started writing. But um, how has it evolved? It's certainly been an education in a lot of ways, in especially in how musicals get to Broadway. And it has been on Broadway twice, and it's been a flop both times. Now, that's a very loaded term, but I'm using the definition by Variety, which was considered the showbiz Bible for a long time. I'm not sure if it still is, but they define a flop as any production which does not recoup its initial investment. And there are a lot of long-running shows that classify that way. Jekyll and Hyde ran for 4 years on Broadway, never recouped. Thoroughly Modern Millie won the Tony Award for Best Musical, and it never recouped. And I don't think Sunset Boulevard did either. But, we live in a capitalist culture, and it's easier to measure success in terms of dollars and cents. But I don't feel Sideshow is a flop because it's meant so much to so many people.
Yes, and there are plenty of things that were not a success when they first started that have since become embraced. And I think
True.
perhaps the most famous example that we can all relate to is The Wizard of Oz, as a film was by definition a flop when it
Right.
opened.
Wow, I forgot that. That is, yes. Wow, that's a good example.
So if you're in good company with The Wizard of Oz, if we're going to use the word flop.
Yes, definitely.
Now, I went back and I looked at Vincent Canby's review of Sideshow when it first opened in the late 90s. And he compared your work as a lyricist in Sideshow to the work of Comden and Green, who had a production of On the Town going on in Central Park the summer prior to your opening. Since Sideshow was your first Broadway musical, not your first musical, but your first Broadway musical, what did that comparison mean to you?
Oh, that meant the world to me. To be mentioned in their company, I mean, they are just legendary, and I love their work. Um, so yeah, that really meant a lot.
Does a comment like that from, I mean, we all know that the theater critic at the New York Times carries probably undue weight, in the theater community. But when somebody like Vincent Canby makes that kind of comparison for you, how did that inspire you for what you wanted to do next?
Well, I was really pleased about it. I mean, Vincent Canby's review of the show was very, very positive, but most of it was a discourse about conjoined twins, and it didn't really help sell tickets. And at that point, I was only obsessed with that because we weren't selling as well as the audience reaction seemed to have warranted, because every performance was getting instant standing ovations, and people just were loving it. So it was a little, I had very mixed emotions, but that particular line, I met Betty Comden once, and I mentioned that. I was just like, I can't believe somebody would compare me with you. So that was a wonderful, wonderful moment for me.
Now, because I have lived in Los Angeles my whole life, I didn't get to see the original production of Sideshow, but I did see the revival, which we will talk about a little bit more later. But it occurred to me, the musical opens, as you know, with Come Look at the Freaks. And it seems like as a society, we have evolved into a people who that's all we do. We just look at the freaks. We look at them on Instagram. We look at them on TikTok. We look at them, everywhere, every possible aspect of social media, and whether you appreciate that or don't appreciate that probably depends on where you're from and how you were brought up. But when you wrote the lyrics for that song, did you ever think that we as a society would embrace being and looking at the Freaks as much as we have today?
No, not really. And when I was first interviewed about the show in the mid '90s, they would ask, "Well, what attracted you to this subject matter? Because sideshows don't even exist anymore." And I said, "Are you kidding? They've moved to afternoon television because Jerry Springer was featuring conjoined twins regularly and much odder people than them." And I do think there's just this fascination that is innate. It's both fascination and repulsion about people who are radically different. But I do believe that we've become much more accepting, and now, as you say, we see freaks everywhere. I'm proud to own that word, by the way, but because I definitely consider myself one, or certainly I did growing up. Yeah, I. It's a good point that they're everywhere now.
Well, and you have a show that encourages the audience to come look at the Freaks, and there was a much more successful show that had the song "Let Your Freak Flag Fly,"
Shrek,
in Shrek
right,
the musical. So
right.
has being a freak become more accepted if it's going to be part of a popular musical like Shrek?
Well, in a way, it has, but it still uh, creates a barrier in terms of selling tickets. I mean, when the revival came about, we thought, oh, that change you're talking about, we really thought, well, now is really the time for this. But women buy the most Broadway tickets, and though Sideshow is very female focused, I think when women hear it's about conjoined twins, they think it's going to be sad and make them uncomfortable, and they do not buy tickets. Once they see the show, they love it, but getting them in just is a problem.
And once they got in, I'm sure they realized the humanity that is expressed on that
Oh,
stage.
oh, they love it almost invariably. They love it. Um,
Um, Go ahead.
it's a continual marketing challenge.
But you had to have known that when you started it. I mean, this isn't as conventional as well as as almost any other show. I mean, it feels like Sideshow and Taboo have a lot in common.
That's nice company too. When I was first pitched this idea, I just was immediately interested because I thought the theatrical possibilities of two actors singing and moving together were great, and the metaphorical ramifications were huge. And once I started diving into their story, I was just so fascinated. And there was a point when Manny Eisenberg, when we were doing readings of the show, came to me and said, "You realize, Bill, that this subject matter has a real ick factor connected with it." And I was like, "What? Really?" I mean, I knew this wasn't exactly standard Broadway fare, but I thought it was just intriguing, and it never occurred to me it would be such a hard sell.
Do you think the hard sell is what has been the biggest stumbling block to this show?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, both Broadway productions had wonderful original cast recordings, and I think those have gone a long way toward alleviating some of that. But in the case of the original production, it didn't come out, the recording, until right before we had to close. So and that didn't help save that. But well, it was true with this too. The new um OCR didn't come out until pretty close to when it closed.
Well, because you also had a shorter run. I mean, the
Yeah,
original run was 91 performances, and the revival sadly only ran 56.
right. Plus previews, a month of
Right.
previews in both cases.
Of
Yeah.
course, of course.
Yeah.
Now you have worked with Ronald Melrose, Janet Hood, Albert Evans, Peter Melnick. What sets your collaborations with Henry Krieger apart from all those other collaborators with whom you've worked?
Well, Henry, is he's such a mensch. He's just a great guy. And he, like Irving Berlin and many other well-known composers, does not read music. So that was different. Although our first meeting, he asked me, he said, how do you prefer to write, music or lyrics first? And I was like, well, I go both ways as a lyricist, but oddly enough, most of the composers I've worked with prefer the lyric first, and that's far from typical. Um, with Henry, he just our process is I live up downtown, he lives downtown. In the morning, I'll work on a lyric, sometimes a whole lyric, but more likely like an intro and a verse or a verse and a chorus. I take it down to him. We will have discussed where it comes in the show, who's singing it, maybe a musical feel, but not always. And he doesn't read it first. He puts it on the piano, sits down, puts his keys on the keyboard, hands on the keyboard rather, and looks up. And after a brief pause, starts singing and playing at the same time. And I would say that 50% of the time, what comes out of his fingers at that moment defines what that song will ultimately be. Then we work it and work it, and maybe he'll write a musical bridge, which I'll put lyrics to. But no, he's a great, and we've done 4 musicals together, and because of that, we've traveled a lot together, and we just have a great time.
Now, I believe I saw a video where your biggest concern about Sideshow was that the music would all have to sound like it was from the 30s.
That's true. I was concerned about that.
And you came up, you both agreed that the performance Sideshow material would sound from the 30s and the rest did not have to. Why was that important to you?
Well, I just didn't want to have to be stuck in that musical mode. I mean, Henry, I fell in love with his music because of Dreamgirls. And so the Hilton Sisters became the highest paid act in the history of vaudeville. And so those vaudeville numbers, we put those in the 30s. And I've had people come up and say, oh, that was Jerome Kern. And we weren't really trying to imitate anyone. Henry just has this sense of like what a 30s song would sound like. So, but I wanted the rest of the score to sound more contemporary because my whole background is rock and roll, really. That was my musical background. And the 6 principles, 5 of them are based on real people. We created the role of Jake, who is African American, and it was partly because I wanted to write with that voice that Henry is so able to access. I also thought it was important thematically because the show is about what it means to be different in our culture, and that unfortunately is manifested most evidently with racism. So I did feel like that was an important key, note to hit in the show.
Now, as with any musical, there are a lot of songs that never see the light of day, or maybe are in early versions of the musical and then get taken out. And I know some of them are like, "Why haven't you learned yet?" Sideshow, The Choice I Made, etc. How painful is it for you as a creator to have to say goodbye to something you put your heart and soul into?
Not so painful during the process. We're so used to it. And I don't start with an outline. I like to find my way in. I like to find my way into the story by telling it as I go along. But first, I have to find my way in musically. And I'm sorry, what was the question? I got lost in.
Yeah, how painful is it to
Oh,
put your
painful.
soul
Yeah.
into these songs and then find that there's no place for them in the show ultimately?
I think when I started writing songs or musicals and we had to cut something, it was like, oh, I can't do that. But anymore, it's just like, it's nothing to write another song, and we frequently would write maybe 5 songs for the same moment in the show, just always refining it. And then we would cut stuff because the plot changed. So that it's never been, or well, not later anyway, it hasn't been that hard. I will say when it came to the revisal and working with Bill Condon, there were a couple songs that were really hard for me to lose, but I totally understood why.
Well, and I'm gonna talk about that because I know Bill. I worked on Dreamgirls on the film. So,
Oh, wow.
so I know a bit about the revival that I'm going to ask you about. But before we
Sure.
go there,
Yeah.
um, is there like a whole alternate world of sideshow that exists in songs we've never heard?
My husband, Bruce, put together a CD of songs we cut, and it's 90 minutes long. And that by no means includes everything. I mean, when we first met with Bill Condon, he had asked for everything we'd written for the original production. And he was mentioning songs we didn't even remember writing. I mean, honestly, we've written so much stuff. Um, so it's quite a bit of music and
Well,
good stuff, some really good stuff. Yeah.
well, I'd like to hear that CD.
I'll send you a copy.
That would be great. Now, in the previous answer, you said, writing songs is easy. You know how many people wish they could say that and mean it?
Well, it's easy for Henry and me, I have to say. We're just so used to and honestly, I could write lyrics every day. I have a much harder problem with books. I think they're much harder, at least for me. But I love writing lyrics, and you can finish them in a finite bit of time, unlike books, which never are finished.
Right. Well, what's the old adage? Great work is never finished. It's just abandoned.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Now, speaking of Bill Condon and Dreamgirls, 2 years
Mhm.
after Dreamgirls came out in theaters as a feature film, you had a reading with the Roundabout. This would be in 2008, and that
Yeah.
began the long journey of bringing it back um, to Broadway. Um, According to Bill, the three of you had been working together for over a year before even that happened. Yet
Abs-
it wasn't until 2014 that the show opened at the St. James. What were those collaborations with Bill like for you, and why do you feel it took as much time as it did for there ultimately to be a production at La Jolla and then the Kennedy Center before going to the St. James?
Well, those sessions with Bill were bliss to me. I have such respect for him. I think he's a genius. I had been a fan of his for so long. He's a great guy, and I thought it was bliss. It is the best way I can describe it. And when I went to the first meeting, I thought, well, we'll be making some changes. I had no idea we would re-examine every syllable, every note of music, but it was thrilling. And the reason it took so long is after that roundabout reading in 2008, which was very well received, Bill was offered to direct the last two Twilight movies of the Twilight Saga. And he spent 3 years filming and editing those together. They filmed in Louisiana. So we didn't work at all for those 3 years together. And the there were business things too. Like the Roundabout produced that reading and then said they had a slot open up and they would love to do sideshow, but they wanted us to bring $3 million, which would not be an investment. It would be a contribution to their nonprofit. And we were like, well, we could maybe get that money, but not if there's no chance of it being recouped. So that delayed things. And the whole reason we started with Bill was because we had an offer for a revival from a well-established regional theater. And then by the time he was available again, they had sort of passed, but the Kennedy Center uh, came on board. It all happened without each other knowing about it. But the Kennedy Center just said they wanted to do a revival, and that's what started the path back to Broadway.
And La Jolla came in after that.
Yeah, well, the Kennedy Center said they wanted to do it, and then um, they said to Henry and me, all we want to do is make you happy. Who would you like to direct? And we said Bill Condon. And they said, well, he's great, but he's never directed for the stage. And we said, that doesn't matter. Really, he's such a great storyteller. It won't matter. And they still weren't convinced. So our agent, Jack Tantliff, got to work and he brought La Jolla on board, which meant there would be two out of town tryouts splitting the production costs. And um, he arranged a meeting in Los Angeles with La Jolla and the Kennedy Center people and Bill, and they all fell in love because Bill gives great meeting. So that's how that happened and eventually came to be.
Now, going through that process at La Jolla, because I saw it opening night at La Jolla.
Mm,
I wasn't at the Kennedy Center, but I did see one of the last previews in New York as well. Clearly, there was the audience response, which was probably similar to what you had in '97.
right.
Did you feel through this process that maybe you had gotten over the ick factor?
Well, I don't keep track of box office so much, especially like in previews. Nobody was saying, but the response was fantastic. That's what I was going by. But again, it was not translating into ticket sales necessarily. I mean, luckily, La Jolla and the Kennedy Center both had subscription bases, so that helped. But they were not. The show was not selling like they had hoped.
Right. Now, I saw an interview that you did with Henry. I think it was for Broadway.com.
Yes.
It was a video interview that you did. You were both at the piano, and you mentioned that only one song remained untouched
Right.
for the 2014 revival. What was that song and why?
It was the Twins' first song, called "Like Everyone Else," and it wasn't intentional that we didn't touch it. It was just that we did touch everything else, and some of the changes in the other songs were just minor lyric tweaks or whatever. But it just so happened that song, nothing changed.
Now, I spoke to Bill prior to the La Jolla opening, and he told me that there were changes to the book. Obviously, I think he told me there was 80% of the book had been changed, and that even new songs were written while you were in La Jolla. And he said, "quote Amazing stuff happens when you put it on its feet. Real revelations." What real revelations happened from your perspective during that production?
Wow. Well, I was pleased that the changes we had made seemed to really be landing. I mean, that just felt and like Bill had come up with this idea of a flashback in Act One, where Terry and Buddy ask the twins about their childhood, which was truly Dickensian. And um, we had written all this stuff originally. We thought at the start of the show they would be 8-year-olds. But then when we started realizing the realities of that, because of child labor laws, we would have to have two sets of twins and a set of understudies. And if you have 5 or more children on Broadway, then you have to hire a child wrangler. So it just became unworkable. But Bill had this idea. He really liked some of that material. And he had this idea to do this flashback, and we reinstated some of that where they were telling Terry and Buddy about their childhood and then they became their younger selves. And what I particularly, well, we wrote a new song for that, for Houdini, called All in the Mind, and that premiered in La Jolla. And what I loved about the flashback was the first song we ever wrote for the twins was I Will Never Leave You. And it was for this moment when they were taken to these doctors who wanted to cut them apart when they were 8 years old. And they sang that to each other as a lullaby to comfort each other. Well, when we gave up the idea of having 8-year-olds, David Chase, the brilliant musical director, said, well, I said, we'll have to lose that song. And he said, oh, no, you can't lose that song. And we moved it to the end. And I wrote an intro where they're looking back on their childhood, but I was never completely satisfied with it because the lyric was so intentionally simple because it was for 8-year-olds, you know? So when the revival happened and we added this flashback, we introduced a chorus of that song early on. and that helped establish it as something they did sang as children. And then we made a major plot change in Act Two where they are offered a legitimate opportunity to be separated. And that really set up, and they decide no, so that really set up the song for the end of the show.
Yeah, and it worked beautifully, I have to say.
Thank you.
Now, there's one song, as you know, that has turned into an anthem for freaks, for performers, singers, and it's "Who Will Love Me As I Am." It's a song that has outlived the show on a certain level. Why do you think that song resonates so much with people? And did you have any sense in writing it that this would become the anthem it has?
Well, that lyric came from a really personal place for me. I grew up in the Black Hills of South Dakota. My grandparents were cattle ranchers over the border in Wyoming. Everybody called my father Cowboy because he was one. He roped calves in rodeos. I mean, the whole thing. And in that hyper macho environment of cattle and cowboys and hunting and sports and cars, I felt like the biggest freak in the world. So when I started working on this show, I just felt right at home. I understood it. And some people regard the show as a gay metaphor, and I'm fine with that because that was really my entry into the world. But I do feel that limits it. I think it's a bigger metaphor than that. And if I've learned anything doing this, it's that I think everyone feels like a freak on some level or at some time in their life, certainly adolescence. So that lyric came from such a personal place. And it was one of the first 5 songs we wrote for the show. And whenever we would play it, people would just were so moved by it. And so I guess I wasn't surprised. I mean, and Sony Classical, who would release the first original cast recording, really wanted to push that song as the song from the show. And I totally get that. I mean, I think it is the core of the show, but I also think out of context, it can sort of be read as a victim song. And we really meant it as a primal scream, which I think it comes off as in the show, but I'm not so sure about just standalone on television, by itself. I'm not sure that helped us. And that is why for the Tony Awards, we chose I Will Never Leave You because we thought it had the resonance also of the show will never leave you.
Right. Now, did your father live long enough to hear that song and to see the show?
Unfortunately, no. He died just when we started writing it.
Well, I'm sure he'd be innately proud of it.
He
Um,
did
and
get to, he
and
did
maybe
get to,
and maybe understand you a little bit better than he did before.
yeah, maybe.
So you and I have had almost 30 minutes talking about this show. You're going to be on stage with artists who have appeared in the musical when you're at Birdland, and you're going to tell some of these stories. Do you think there's going to come a time where Sideshow will be loved as it is?
Oh, I think it is. That time arrived back with the original. It's just the people's perception of what it might be like if they haven't seen it. That's the issue, not from people who see it. And it's already, I mean, at least once or twice a month, somebody comes up to me, having found out that I wrote the book and lyrics for Sideshow, and they just go off about it, how much the show means to them and how much hearing the album when they were in college, how they just couldn't stop playing it. I mean, that is, I can't think of anything more gratifying for a writer. It's more gratifying to me than making millions of dollars from a huge commercial hit.
So what's the biggest lesson you've taken away from your experience of Sideshow, and might you be sharing that at this show at Birdland?
Well, the challenge of the Birdland show is it can only be 75 minutes long, and I could talk for hours about this because the saga is just so interesting. So that's my big challenge with that. Gee, the main thing I guess I've learned is you, if you do something like this that you just totally believe in, stay with it, and the rewards may not be apparent. They weren't to Variety and that definition, but the rewards can be incredible. And I am thrilled that I wrote this show with Henry. I just, the gifts it has returned have been manifold.